We have two new IEMs today, the Punch Audio Martillo and the Software Studio 2. Starting with the Martillos, this is a balanced bass headset. If you like the DEUCE, the Legatos, the Crinier, Zero Bluetooths, then the Martillos would be the direct bass head upgrade to those. It has a familiar sub-bass focused sound, that subwoofer kind of like bouncy sound signature. You can picture the Martillo as a more V-shaped version of the DEUCE with better detail, clarity, and separation. The low-end texture, impact, rumble is all there. The sub-bass extends very deep on hip-hop tracks and like artists like Pierre Bourne, Cardi, Kendrick, but at the same time, it's also well controlled without sacrificing the vocals and the treble extension. In that sense, the Martillos reminds me of the Symphonium Titans, which is also a bass headset, but still very well balanced for the amount of low end you are getting on both the Martillos and the Titans. Basically, this is a mini Titan at 3 times less the cost. The Martillo has the same slightly energetic tonality in the treble and the upper mids like the Titan, which adds that extra bit of excitement on top of just like slamming you with a crap ton of bass. This is very similar to the HBB Punch as well, but just less thick in the mid bass, a little bit snappier in the attack and decay, feels a little bit like quicker, and also less smooth in the treble because it just doesn't have the ESTs, as well as because of the extra energy on top of that. Tech wise, these are pretty good for a bass headset. It sits around the same as the HBB Punch, but with like slightly sharper imaging because of the upper mids boost, and for $100 less, which is pretty great. And if you wanted a livelier version of the Punch, then the Martillos would be a nice side grade to those. It's not as quite smooth in the treble, not as refined, doesn't scale as well as the Punch or the DEUCE, but I do dig the slightly more energetic playback just like the Titans. Now, scaling wise, the Martillo is more of a mid to mid high volume set, so we're talking around 60 to 75 dBs. Both the DEUCE and the Punch will scale better because it just has less extension in the upper mids and the treble, a little bit more fuller in the mid bass with the Punch, and this has a slightly more edgier tone to it compared to the other two. However, the planar that they're using doesn't feel overly boosted. It doesn't feel like sizzly or artificial in the timbre, which is good. But again, combined with the elevated highs, the Martillos do come off as a little bit sharper, a little bit more energetic, livelier, which means you can't really blast the crap out of these. As for some other comparisons versus the Doscincos, the DOS is a mid-bass focused set. It slams harder, it feels a little bit like fuller in the drums, it has more energy when it comes to the rhythmic section, feels thicker, a bit warmer, smoother overall, and just less energetic and less V-shaped compared to the Martillos. Tech-wise, the Martillos are a step up over the DOS when it comes to the imaging, the clarity, the treble detail, the vocals pop out a little bit more, it feels more clean. If you have the DOS already, the Martillos would be a nice side grade or even an upgrade when it comes to the tech. It's a side grade when it comes to tonality because you now have a more sub-bass focused set versus something that is more mid-bass like the Doscincos. Then compared to the Estrella, T-Pros, and Hi-4s, the Martillo is more of a bass head set. It just has more low-end energy, it has more sub-bass, and also a little bit more treble as well. It's a slightly more V-shaped version of those, which makes it less balanced and less like all-rounder versus the other three. The Martillos are a slight step down when it comes to the separation and overall vocal clarity, just because of the pure like sheer amount of low end that you have. It does take away some focus from the other region. It doesn't bleed or anything, but it's not going to be as well balanced. It still has solid technicalities, I would say, but just not as good as the Estrellas or the Hi-4s and T-Pros. All four have different use cases. It's not going to overlap. For example, if you want a bass head set, then that would be the Martillos. If you want an all-rounder that has good bass texture, then the rest would just be the better fit in that scenario. But aside from that, I do recommend the Martillos for bass heads. It's a well-balanced set while still being exciting enough and delivering on the low-end texture and quantity. These are also 3 times cheaper than the Titans and $100 less than the Punch, while punching, no pun intended, around the same level sound-wise. And the overall packaging is also pretty solid. You get a pretty nice cable as well. So in terms of value, these are pretty competitive overall, and I do recommend giving these a try. On the other hand, the Studio 2s are a very interesting set to say the least. My initial impressions of these were not very good. To me, it sounded like I was listening to speakers underwater, absolutely low res, like I was about to crash out, like 169 for these, until I cranked these up. So for 90% of you guys watching, the Studio 2 is gonna be a pass. I do not recommend them. It's gonna sound too dark, congested, low res at mid volume or even lower volumes, because they do need to be listened at a high volume. Like I'm talking at least 75 to 80 dBs minimum. However, for the rest of you guys who do listen louder, these are basically a warmer version of the AFUL Explorer that scales arguably better depending on the song. For example, Bon Iver, the Mariahs, Ethel Cain, Lizzie McAlpin, indie, slow rock, acoustics, all sound incredibly immersive, natural, and like very full and just very emotional and intimate on these Studio 2s. It has this like warm vintage and smooth, relaxing sound to the track. It is definitely colored, but it is pretty unique in the overall sound. At higher volumes, the 8 to 10K peak adds just enough resolution and clarity without the Studio 2 being like overly smoothed out, too dark, or too sharp. And obviously this is not an airy, crispy, or super detailed and technical set by any means, but it somehow works if you give it some scaling. For those who watch Shokugeki or Food Wars, this reminds me of Soma just like experimenting with different foods like octopus and peanut butter, and it somehow works. This is giving me the same vibe as that. And since this is a mid-bass focused set with a more like linear kind of like bass glide, more neutral in the sub bass, not very boosted, it doesn't have that overwhelming bassy kind of feeling that overtakes the vocals. I'm not saying this is a vocal powerhouse or anything, but again, it somehow works because the vocals are still clear on like indie and slower tracks, because the sub bass doesn't overtake the rest of the region, as well as because of the timbre treble, it also doesn't get in the way of the vocals. So it somehow kind of works. The Studio 2s also surprisingly sound pretty decent with like hip hop, pop, R&B at higher volumes. It's not gonna be my first pick for those, but it does sound decent. It's a pass. It's not horrible because the upper mids are pretty tame. It doesn't get shouty. You get enough mid bass, enough sub bass to make it like, engaging enough. And again, I wouldn't recommend it, but it does work for those genres. Tip wise, the stock tips work, as well as the Software Ultra Clears, the Senkais, the Venus, even the Clarions if you want a little bit more treble. Just don't add too much bass on these because they are a little bit like warm already, right? Any tip would work, but this brings me to its value proposition. Like, who are these for? Because tech-wise, this isn't even as good as the EW300 or the Define, which are all much cheaper. You can get the EW300 for like 60 bucks, which is like less, 2 times less than the Studio 2s. Defiant may be on sale like $80 or something, like still cheaper than the Studio 2s. They are more detailed, more resolving, cleaner, and I would put these around the same technical level as the Define Clean, which is not the best because that's a $50 to $30 IEM, right? So you're not buying these for the technical performance. However, tonality wise, I cannot think of another IEM around its price that has this like warm, vintage, laid back, but still very immersive and high scaling sound. The closest would be the HIDIZS MK12 red nozzles, but even then that's pretty different. It's like more balanced. The vocals are more forward, it's more vocal centric, less like laid back and vintage as the Studio 2s. And then the other one would be the Explorer, which again, it is like similar, but the Studio 2s are much warmer, more I guess like neutral, but also warm at the same time. So comparison wise, it's very hard for me to compare it to because it's just very different. But tech wise, I will say it is less technical than all its competitors at its price. Again, this is a very weird and quirky IEM, and for the vast majority of you guys who don't listen loud, this is going to be a pass. You're gonna think these Studio 2s are just like low res, dark, congested, lacking detail, overpriced, yada yada. However, with scaling and the genres and artists I mentioned before, I would give these a maybe on sale. If you can, I would demo these first because this is more of an acquired taste like Darien or Century Eggs. It is definitely not a blind buy worthy kind of set. It is too expensive at $169 considering the performance or the lack of performance in this case. If the Studio 2 was like $80, I would say, go for it. I would like probably get it just to listen to it because just how different it is. But at $169, it is kind of a hard sell, especially considering the competition around it. Because at that point, you would be essentially buying it for the tonality alone, which is perfectly fine. But just know what you're getting yourself into. All in all, very interesting release from Softwares. If you have the Studio 2s, comment below and let us know your thoughts because I am genuinely curious on what people think of this. I know the Martillo will do just fine. It's a great base set, very good for the value, but Studio 2s, that's more like a black sheep, underdog kind of IEM, if you know what I'm saying. But aside from that, I hope this review was helpful. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see everyone in the next one.
Shout out to Roark's Cat, Dom Q, The Skull Goddess, B. Urak, Mystic Spoon Attack, Walker Standard, User, Patrick, Polly J, Mr. Gabriellas, Giseng Young, Christopher Jackson, Henry Claudia, Son of a Horse, Obi, Wizard, Frickalicious, Ricardo, Tapas Art, Shin Bakle, Choconorris, FKSRG, Treble Will Extended, Cousin Fat Fat, O'Reilly, Julius, Dead Riddle, Billha, Tamat, Ardmore, 777ZK, Jasper, Nicholas, Gerbless, Parham, Contain Guava Juice Gains, Addy, Brandon, and Syrah Cool Gaming. Thank you guys so much.